All the best stories start around a warm, crackling fire, so I figured, why try to fix what isn't really broken? Except today there is a problem that needs to be fixed, and that's this fireplace set. It's definitely not the most well-made set in existence. The handles are a little short for my liking, and it's just overall not a great product. So my client really challenged me on this project. She wanted something better quality that looked more alive, had more spirit, and could ultimately be passed down. So I compared the cheap set to some tools that I've made in the past. If you look at this shovel, it's very similar to that one that I made, and it's kind of rotting away. And this brush is all plastic with plastic threads. I just know it's not going to last. Now this is the piece that I have the most issue with. You can tell this thing's hollow. They do that to save on building costs, shipping costs, all that stuff. They make it really lightweight. The base just has these little nuts holding it on. Those are definitely going to loosen up over time, and I've actually tightened them again. And even when they're tight, this whole thing wobbles quite a bit. Not ideal to bump into your stand and have it fall over that easy, or, you know, have it bend. I can't imagine this thing's real hard to bend. Yeah, that whole stand already messed up, and now this is creased. You'll never be able to fix that. Not well anyways. It's better just to rebuild at that point. Fortunately, that's what we're gonna do. Oh, you're still here. This video is sponsored by DeWall's Forge, because we don't have anyone else. We typically wouldn't sponsor anyone or anything unless we had some kind of a connection with them or their product, and we knew it was something we would use or we thought was good. We try to make all kinds of products, from fire pokers to cheese cutters. And Abby, who's back there, does all kinds of things, from pottery to saw painting and anything in between. We want our stuff to be heirloom quality, sturdy, and useful. We also take on custom orders, and if there's anything you don't see in our shop that you'd like to see, please let us know. If we don't have it and you want it, we can try our best to make it happen. If you want heirloom quality, handcrafted goodness, look no further than DeWall's Forge. Back to the video. I almost dropped that. I actually got to visit my client's home to see where this thing was going to live, and it's a beautiful space. So based on what I saw there and their style, they really love a natural aesthetic. I went ahead and drew up some really rough sketches of what I thought would look nice there and submitted them, and they loved the idea. And then the real work began. So I went ahead and started making the stand first. I think the idea that old stand was just so chintzy and basically ready for the garbage right out of the box, I wanted to try to make something as good as I could right out of the gate. It was also going to be the most difficult part of the build. It's using the thickest pieces of steel, and I've never really made one like this, so it was a bit of an experiment. The other thing is, it needed to be the right height in order to hold the tools correctly, so that they're not dragging on the ground when you try to hang them up. So here we have 4 sturdy bars tapered and ready to go. I went ahead and tack welded them together to hold them for this part, and now we're going to get it hot and begin our twisting process, which is going to be a whole lot harder than what Roxy's doing here. This was hands down probably the most tedious and difficult part of the whole project for me. This is 4 half-inch thick pieces of steel being twisted together by hand, and it's really hard to grab a hold of them reliably and comfortably and actually get that thing to twist. And so it really boiled down to some good old-fashioned trial and error to get the technique nailed down. I have made a couple of sculpture pieces with this same element, same steel and everything, but I just couldn't really remember how I did it, and honestly, the way I did it before probably wasn't very efficient. And eventually, once I started rolling with this, I got pretty smooth at it, and I was able to keep it fairly straight as I went down the whole length of the stand. With that twisting all finished up, I was left with this scary looking monstrosity that I had to really be careful not to stab myself with. Here I'm splaying out these legs so I can transition into kind of twisting them up a little bit, making them look more viney, but I had to make sure they were kind of straight first before working on the fun part. Which leads to probably the most dangerous part of the build right here. I have pointy hot pieces of metal and most of them are pointed straight at me, so I had to be really careful how I held and braced this thing while I started making the legs look a little more viney and organic. But sometimes we just have to do crazy things for our art and the things we love to do. As this thing was really starting to take shape, I kept taking it down to the floor just to make sure the legs were all flat and level and that they were going to sit really nice and hold the stand straight up and down. When the stand got to that point, I just needed to step back and take a break from it and let the whole thing cool down while I went and cut parts for the next pieces of the project. And when it was cool enough, I couldn't help but find out how much it weighed. It's like close to 12 pounds. That is a far cry from that really lightweight chintzy thing we broke earlier. On this day, I had a few different projects going on in the shop, and most of them were things I needed to wait for. So for some reason, I decided it would be a good idea to cut out this shovel blank the old-fashioned way. It is a healthy thing to work on old skills once in a while in order to keep them refined and remember how to do it the old way. It kind of fits the spirit of the craft anyways. Now there's a shovel head that'll take a very long time to wear out. But first, it's back to the old stand. Now I have to work on the slightly less dangerous part and spread this thing out kind of like a flower. Then we needed to get rid of those sharp points, so I made some little scrolls on the end that also double as a nice little decoration. Finally, the hooks. These little hooks and things like them usually go pretty easily, but when you're swinging a 15-pound block of iron around and trying to hammer on it while it's hot, it makes it a little challenging sometimes. When the first one was all finished up, we just have to test it to see how it looks. I think that ought to work. We just have to do that a few more times and we'll have a basically completed stand. When I'm working on hooks like these, I'll often dip that little scroll into water to cool it down really quickly. That way I don't smush it when I'm trying to actually form the hook and do some hammering on it. Well, there's our big old twisted viney monstrosity. We kept joking that it looked like it was going to start crawling towards us. Once again, I had another bit of an intermission and I wanted to check out this corn broom brush that I bought to see if it was going to work. And when I cut open that plastic handle, it wasn't exactly what I thought it was. I was hoping there was going to be a little bit more meat on the upper end of that brush, but there really wasn't, so I had to take a break and start working on the other things while I thought about how I was going to make that corn broom work. I even considered buying some broom corn stalks in order to tie up a fresh one myself, but it just wasn't in the cards and I was on a little bit of a time crunch. But I had plenty of work to do while I thought about that and chewed on the idea. And this is the part of the project that I'm the most familiar with. Now, the client really wanted my leaves. She loves the look of my leaves on my stuff, and she's bought several things with our leaves on them before. And these are going to be one of the more focal pieces for these handles, so I wanted to nail them, and I wanted them to all be pretty similar, and that's why I just made them over and over again, all in a short consecutive time. I sped up the veining process on these clips a few different ways in order to really highlight it, because it's really satisfying to see these leaves go from spear points into something that looks more like an actual leaf. With the leaves mostly finished up, it was time to head on to making the actual handle part. Now I wanted to make the handles a little bit different than the fire pokers I normally make. I wanted to mimic that original set a little bit, but better. And that all starts with drawing out the stem that connects to the leaf, because if that transition is too harsh, it's going to look really weird. You're going to have a fat stem going to this skinny little leaf, and it just doesn't look right. So once that was done, I started to forge these little loops on the end, trying to make them about the same size and get them ready for some wrapping. And let's not forget the final details of the leaf. I usually go over with a couple different hammers just to add some extra texture. To me, it just gives it a lot more dimension and life. And the final, and probably the funnest part to me, is actually doing the handle wrap. I'm going to take that excess stem and just wrap it right around the handle, right above the loop, in order to make, again, something that looks pretty viney and organic with that wrap effect. I also wanted that wrap to be nice and tight, and every so often I just had to bring the hammer down on those tongs to really cinch everything out. As with any project, sometimes you come in ill-prepared and you have to use a pair of tongs as a hammer. The last step on these leaves was to get them tucked in and looking good. I needed to add some extra heat from the last step in order to get these things bent. If you try to do this too cold, they're definitely going to crack along either a chisel line or right at that stem, and that is a big bummer and you have to end up restarting the project. I didn't really want to do that on any of these because time is money. It's also really annoying to have to go back and fix mistakes that you made that could have been prevented with just a little bit more time on this front end. There's our pretty little leafy handles. Hopefully they work out. You can see the aesthetic I'm kind of going for here. It's that twisty, viney, leafy, natural appeal. Let's get back to that shovel head we started earlier. The way it is right now, it's not going to make a great shovel. It's more of a spatula or a flipper. We want it to be able to hold some ash in order to get it out of there, not just spill it and flip it everywhere. So the name of the game is building up those sidewalls for scooping. About the time I finished up the shovel head, the handles were cool enough to, well, handle. I wanted to incorporate a twist onto them, but you can't exactly twist round stock. You need to have some kind of a flat spot on it in order for it to show up. And the result of doing it this way is a nice subtle twist that makes that handle just pop and stick out a little bit more. And I really love the look of doing a reverse twist, which is twisting clockwise one direction and counterclockwise the other direction a little further down the bar. Sometimes you have to use a little water to cool off that middle part so you don't untwist what you already twisted. And it always just looks so nice to me. It's one of my favorite twists and it's super simple to do. At this point, I'm finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm getting excited to be able to get everything attached and finished up. First off is attaching the shovel head to the shovel handle. I always kind of like to pre-mark and pre-bend things in order to make the final fit a little bit easier before we drill and start riveting everything together. When everything fit kind of close, I was able to go over to my old friend Mr. Drill Press and get these holes popped in there. Now the old-fashioned way would be to punch it, but drilling it is just easier and it gives me the perfect size hole for the rivets that I'm using. I will, however, be doing some traditional punching later when we get to the fireplace tongs, so hold on to your hats. I start these rivets by swedging straight down on them to start spreading the metal out, and then I'll use the ball end of the ball peen hammer to go around and actually round that rivet head out. And I said earlier that I fit this piece close enough, so obviously it needs some tweaking before we drill the next hole in the shovel head. But after a little bit of straightening, I could fasten that second rivet down and finish up the shovel. Except for one more bend to actually bend the shovel head down a bit, because that was a weird angle to have it at. The next tool to finish up is the fire poker. I do this a lot with these round stock ones. I'll usually make a little scarf on the end, and then we're gonna make a loop on the bar, match that scarf up with the piece of metal, and do a forge weld to set everything together. This weird can of powder is a type of flux that I'll be using to help set the weld. It makes kind of a glass to protect the steel from oxygen that would keep it from welding together. And with enough heat and some light taps with the hammer, in theory that thing should be pretty well set up. The test comes when I cut that loop in half and see if everything holds together or if it flops right apart. Looks like it's holding up pretty well though. Now we just have to hammer each of these pieces out to a nice sharp point and we'll have a beautiful fire poker ready to go. It can be a little bit goofy working on these tapers on the ends of these pokers. But after a few hundred tries, your muscle memory starts to kick in and you start to figure out ways to make it go a little bit easier. But with the bottom part done, let's finish up that hook and we can work on the main poker point. By the looks of things, that ought to poke. It could also make a really nice discipline stick in a time of need. Let's take a look at it and see if we like it, and when it looks good enough, let's hang it up and work on that last tool, or two tools. As I was still kind of chewing through the broom project in my mind, I decided that I wanted to do the tongs first. And with the style of tongs that I chose, the first jaw needed a split or a fork on the end. As the tines of this fork are finally being drawn out, I usually take it to the end of the anvil and do a rough measurement to make sure they're even before I do all the final bending. If I do that bending first and the tines aren't pretty close to the same length, it's not going to look very good. For these, the tines needed a little bit of a curvature in order to make them work correctly with the other jaw. And then it's time for that hot punching we talked about earlier. First, I need to make a flat spot that I can punch through. Next, I like to make a small punch mark with a center punch in order to figure out where I'm going to do the actual punching later, which is where this comes into play. I really like punching in instances like this where there's already not a lot of metal to work with because it's not going to remove as much steel from the stock. What we're really doing is displacing metal out of the way to bolster the eye around that hole. In the long run, it's going to give that pivot point more steel, more quote-unquote meat to work with, and it's going to make it last a lot longer and do its job a little bit better. Now I just needed to make that second jaw, which is a whole lot easier than the first one. I'm just doing a single point that will nestle between those two other fork points that we made earlier. You may not have noticed after that first punch, but I actually shoved a different punch through there towards the end of the process, which is called a drift. And the drift is what gives that hole its final size and shape, because we want it to actually match our rivet that we're going to be popping through there. And you guessed it, I don't actually have a rivet the right size, so I guess we're going to go ahead and make that too. And honestly, it's really not that big of a deal. If I was going to be doing a lot of riveting, this would be kind of a pain, but for just one or two here and there, not so bad. We're going to clamp this thing in the vise, and we're going to upset it, and then I just have this piece of metal with the proper size hole drilled through where I can slip through and I can work on the head. A little bit of persuading with the old persuader later, and we could stick these two halves of the tongs together and figure out the proper rivet length in order to get them stuck together. And the best tool for that is this crusty old hacksaw with a dull blade. Here I'm just making doubly sure that the two parts of these tongs are touching together nice and tight. If I start setting that rivet too early, if those tong jaws are spread apart, you can cause issues, and it's not fun to try to fix that. And after a little bit of cold setting, I got it hot to finish off that rivet and make it really nice and tight. And the final step on these tongs is to make the handles. Now, as I worked on them, I realized I probably should have did this before I riveted them together, but live and learn. It maybe took a little bit longer than it would have otherwise, but you just gotta do the balancing act sometimes. Of course, again, we're gonna stylize this thing with those leaves because you wanted lots of leaves, and so that's what we're gonna do. Again, we have to stretch those stems out. I I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to do with the handles. I was kind of debating back and forth in my mind a little bit while I made them. But ultimately I came up with an idea that I thought would look pretty nice, and I was pretty convinced it was going to work out okay. The other thing I had to be a little bit concerned with, and that I just kept checking over and over, was making sure that I was drawing these handles out to about the same length, even with the leaf on the end. Now close counts, but if they're really far off, you'll definitely notice in the end product. And this right here was a big part of why I probably should have did the handles first before riveting them together. They just kind of kept getting in the way of one another. I made it work out, but it wasn't exactly fun. And in the end, I settled with the simple idea of simply bending these handles around and kind of making the leaf curl around the other end of the handle. It just looks good, it looks sturdy, and I think it'll work out fine. As usual, things never come out perfect the first time, so sometimes there's a little bit of tweaking involved in order to get it to work the way you want it to work. When everything was said and done, it was time to head over to the wax factory and get these things sealed up in this traditional finish. If you get the metal too hot, you end up with a nice little explosion of flames that has taken more of my facial hair than I care to admit over the years. I always say that this process is very similar to seasoning a cast iron pan. We're just burning and carbonizing that layer on there in order to protect it from oxygen. It also gives it that really nice black look. Before putting the finish on the stand, I looked it over one more time, and the legs were splayed out a little bit further than they needed to be. I wanted to tighten them in a little bit so that base wasn't so stretched out there, so I just curled everything a bit tighter. And I also settled with an idea to make this broom work. I welded that little piece of steel onto the handle, and that gave me a nice anchor point to wrap some wire around so that things won't slip off when it's all tied together. Now, I'm doing this similarly to how you would actually do one of these brooms, so I'm pretty convinced it's going to hold up, especially with this steel wire. Everything was wrapped up nice and tight. Of course, we have to trim the end to make it look good, because it looked kind of scraggly before. And we can't forget about the sweep test. Always need to do a sweep test. We'll get rid of this junky old handle too. When it comes to these large, long pieces, I typically will wax them one half at a time. So this is just finishing that top half, getting that nice layer smoked down there. Then we can put everything together and it should be ready to go. Overall, I was quite happy with how this turned out. It pretty much went exactly with what I was thinking, and the client was super happy with it. I think we made a nice living piece of art. This is something that should last forever. It can be handed down, and boy, it looks great in front of a crackling fireplace. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe because it helps our channel grow. And if there are any video ideas you want to see come to life, like this fireplace set, we would love the ideas and the suggestions. Special thank you to the real sponsor of this video, our client who commissioned this set. We also thank you for the pictures and videos.